Welcome, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March the 26th, and on Tuesdays we have Mr. Dwoskin presenting his In the Headlines lecture series. Mr. Dwoskin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, you're not coming in.
Mr. Dwoskin, you could go ahead. Mr. Dwoskin,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
could
you were
start.
not clear. Can you hear? Okay,
Yes,
can you hear me now? Can you hear me well?
yes.
Okay,
The
good.
you could start your
Hi
lecture.
everyone. Yeah. So hi everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly current events class. Thank you, Angela, for introducing me. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. We have a few subjects to speak about today, as usual. Some interesting ones, some current ones, some more philosophical ones. So let me just start with the attack that occurred in Moscow, which killed so many people. I think the death toll is now 140, not counting all the injured people. And this must have been a shock to the whole Russian system, especially to the Russian security system, which purports to be protective of all its citizens. Remember that the whole war that they started in the Ukraine was supposed to be a war of self-protection against threats to the Russian country by Ukraine or by the West as a whole. And Russia has committed itself so far to a 2+ year war with certainly casualties that must amount to well over somewhere around 100,000 soldiers and other people must have been killed in that 2-year war so far. And here you've got an attack in the very heart of Moscow at a cultural event, which clearly showed that the Russian security system was not prepared for this, that Mr. Putin's ability to defend all Russians is called into question by this attack. And it's an attack on a musical venue where only innocent people were attending, especially young people. And so this sort of strikes at the heart of the Russian security system. It strikes right at the heart of Mr. Putin. And an attack like this is not unprecedented. If we look back in just recent history, there have been a number of attacks on the most famous one was on a school in southern Russia. There have been other attacks as well on civilian properties in over the time. All of these attacks, this one and the one on the school in Beslan and other ones, have all been perpetrated by one wing or another of Islamic radicals, people who were inspired by ISIS, ISIS itself, Islamic radicals from within Russia, especially from the Chechen region of Russia, or its neighboring province, the Dagestan region of Russia, where there are many, many homegrown Islamic radicals or Islamic militants with a military background, or people coming from outside of Russia. In this case, it's not completely clear because they called the perpetrators Tajiks, but there are many thousands and thousands of Tajiks who live inside Russia already. And of course, there's a separate country called Tajikistan, which actually does not border Russia, but is one of the former Soviet republics which made up the Soviet Union. Mr. Putin, of course, tried to link this to the Ukrainian war, which there's no link whatsoever. He said that the perpetrators were going to escape to the Ukraine. But if you figure out how far Moscow is from the Ukraine, and if you figure out that the Russian troops are on the front lines of the Ukrainian border, and if you figure out that the whole front line is mined, you could see what kind of a ridiculous statement that is, and pretty unlikely to be believed by anybody who has common sense. But obviously, from Mr. Putin's point of view, it would be a good idea to blame everything on the Ukraine, even if they have no responsibility whatsoever. And of course, the Ukraine denied any responsibility in this affair. So the question becomes then, why would Islamic radicals of whatever stripe they belong to, why would they want to attack Russia? There is a on the surface of it, there doesn't seem to be a kind of a good logical explanation. But on the other hand, if you go back in history and if you think about it a little bit more, then there is a definite kind of connection between the antagonism of Muslim fundamentalists and Russia. We could go back, of course, to the Soviet Union, which tried to erase and eradicate all religions from that country, including Islam. They destroyed and closed thousands and thousands of churches, mosques, and synagogues in the country. They viewed any kind of outward religion as being anti-Soviet. And so for 70 years, people either had to hide their religious observance or they just basically forgot about it altogether. And miraculously enough, when the Soviet Union did collapse in the 1990s, there was a rebirth of all religions in what became Russia. The other parts of the Soviet Union having dropped away and become separated countries, including Tajikistan, including other Muslim majority republics like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. These countries all became independent. But within Russia itself, within the new constituted country of Russia, all kinds of religions flourished, meaning that synagogues were open, churches were open, mosques were rebuilt, and there was a kind of a flourishing of religion to the point where the Russian state kind of adopted the Russian Orthodox Christianity as their not official religion, but the main religion. And Mr. Putin often invited Russian Orthodox Church leaders, priests to important ceremonies, and other religious leaders as well to important ceremonies. It's important to understand that Russia itself has a very large Muslim population. And not only is it a large population, but it's a population which is growing faster, much faster than the average population in the country. So at this point, somewhere around 14 or 15% of all Russians are Muslims. And they are people who live in certain geographic areas, but have also moved around to live in the main cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other main cities as well. And these people take part in Russian daily life. They're part of the military. They're part of all aspects of Russian society. However, there have been disruptions, we'll say, or there have been anti-state activities on the part of some of the Muslim populations of Russia, particularly the ones who are more devoutly Muslim. And these people live, as I mentioned before, in Chechnya and in Dagestan, which would be located in southern central Russia, and whose populations have either been preyed on by the Russian state or have been co-opted by the Russian state. In the case of Chechnya, after two wars, two very bitter wars where the province was destroyed, Russia decided in the case of Chechnya to hand over the leadership to a local warlord, and this local warlord then serves Russia as its delegate in Chechnya. We also have to remember that there's hundreds of thousands of non-Russian citizens who've moved to Russia from those republics that I mentioned for economic purposes, to get jobs, to send money home, to live a better life than they could live in their own republics. And so these people are also a source of, you know, of adding to the Muslim population of Russia, even though they're not citizens themselves. And I don't know for sure if these Tajiks who committed this attack, this terrorism, were people of that nature, in other words, Tajiks who were living in Russia, or were they people who came directly from Tajikistan to carry out this attack, and you know, presumably would have liked to go back home before being caught. In any case, this was a shocking attack to Russia. It doesn't take much of an imagination to link this attack to the Hamas attack on the concert in Israel, or to another Islamic terrorist attack on a concert in France, Bataclan concert venue, or to one in England at the Ariana Grande concert. So you have to say to yourself, well, why is it that the concerts seem to attract the attention of these Islamic radicals? And it's because it seems to go against everything that these people stand for. Young people getting together, music, just kind of a freer life for young people than how these people imagine society should be, which is, you know, women should be, and young women in particular, should not be seen with other young men. So it's a kind of a, you know, anti-feminist, and it's an anti-modern, and it's an anti-secular, and it's a whole list of antis that bother these people. And clearly these people are innocent bystanders. They are people who have no means of self-defense. And I'm just wondering, in particular with the Hamas attack on the concert in Israel, if people in Russia would put two and two together and say, you know what, look what Hamas did to Israel, and look what these people did to us. And maybe we should not be that critical of what Israel is doing in Gaza, as the Russian government is. So I think that this is an ongoing story, that Russia is far from finished with dealing with the aftermath of this massacre, and that people who want to be critical of Putin have a reason to do that. And if there are people in the Russian government who are critical of militant Islam, this is definitely their excuse for going against that element. Remember that in Afghanistan, which is the sort of birthplace of, wasn't the birthplace of ISIS, but it's where ISIS is particularly strong, Russia fought a years-long civil war against the Islamic militants who were backed at that time by the United States. These people eventually turned into the Taliban, who attacked. They turned into the Taliban, who took over the country, and who gave cover and being hosts to the Al Qaeda movement, which attacked the World Trade Center in the United States. And the United States, of course, fought a war to get back at them, and in the process kicked the Taliban out of power. And to make a long story short, now the Taliban are back in power. But the Taliban and ISIS are actually two very different movements, very antagonistic to each other, because believe it or not, ISIS has been operating in Afghanistan against the Taliban. And their feeling is that the Taliban are not sufficiently radical and
Mr. Dwoskin, we can't hear you.
Wait. How about, can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So, something just went off in the middle there. I don't know, could be internet stopped or I don't know what, but I don't know what it is. But anyway, so I'm glad you can hear me now. And let me just continue to say that these ISIS people have a lot against Russia, not only because of Russia's long involvement in the civil war in Afghanistan, but Russia supporting Syria, which fought very hard against ISIS at the time when ISIS controlled part of Syria and Iraq. So Mr. Assad was the main enemy of ISIS in Syria, and Russia was, of course, the one who kept Assad in power in Syria instead of having the Syrian government collapse and having ISIS take over the whole country. So in the mind of these radical Muslims, Russia is not a friend but an enemy, and it is also a way of showing the power that these people have to penetrate into the heart of Moscow and to create, such a horrible attack on Moscow. Remember, the last time that there was a kind of an attack on Moscow was Mr. Prigozhin, who was this sort of warlord attached to the Russian forces in the Ukraine, and who was unhappy with the way the Russian Defense Ministry was doing and the way the war was going, and he marched his troops into going toward Moscow. He stopped before he got there, and eventually, of course, Mr. Putin blew him up in a plane. So these people managed to go right into the heart of Moscow and carry out this attack, which, like I said, the news of the day, the news cycle is so short that, it's moved on and talking about a bridge falling down in Baltimore. But you can be sure that in Russia itself, the echoes of this attack will last for a very, very long time, simply because there was just so many casualties, and because it occurred in Moscow, the capital of the country, the biggest city in the country, and in all likelihood, the people who were killed in that attack were people who were, we'll call them, let's say, children of the elites who could afford to go to a concert. So, I think this is just chapter one. I think that the story of the arrest of these people, and you saw, of course, or if you didn't see the pictures of them, they were completely beaten up by their interrogators. Obviously, no lawyers present. Obviously, they'll be found guilty of everything. Um, but I don't believe that this story will end with them. I think this will have more consequences. it could well be that this attack could be used as a sort of a reason for cracking down on militant Islam in Russia, which is not aligned to the goals of Mr. Putin. So that's that. I wanted to speak about a few other things. By the way, for those of you, and I know there's so many of you who have friends and relatives in Florida who are driving up or about to drive up back home, the collapse of this bridge is definitely an enormous tragedy and will complicate the drive north for millions of people who are coming north from Florida and going into the northeast of the US, to New York, New Jersey, and even coming into Quebec, because the Route 95 passes right over that bridge. I read an essay in, I believe, I'm not positive, you know what, I think I forget where I read it. But it talked about, so I'm changing a bit of the subject now, how liberalism, so I think I must have read this in The Economist because it's a liberal, small L liberal magazine. And it talks about the twin, the two ideas, or the two philosophies, political philosophies of liberalism on the one hand, and kind of the opposite of liberalism, which is a kind of nationalism or populism on the other hand. And why liberalism finds it so difficult to make its way in this type of society. And so don't confuse liberalism with the Liberal Party of Canada or the Liberal Party of Quebec, because although they overlap, the ideas are not exactly the same thing. But the gist of the article was that when people feel very insecure or feel threatened in some way or other, they feel that they can't by themselves solve their own problems. And liberalism was an idea that said that people themselves are responsible for their own futures, and that where the state or the government is in charge of running the country, that the country run by liberals should be one that has a kind of a laissez-faire attitude, and not one which controls everything in people's lives. It's also a government which admits that they can't solve everyone's problems, that they don't have all the answers, that negotiations and compromises are things that should be done on a item by item, an item by item or issue by issue legislation, and not one where the government has a whole set of preordained ideas which they want to impose on everybody. So when things are going well, either economically or socially, where there is no conflict between people over religion or over race or over ethnic identity or nationality, liberalism sort of fits the bill. And it sort of creates a kind of a guardrails. If you can imagine a sort of guardrails on two sides of a road, and where you drive on the road kind of is your own choice. The opposite of liberalism is where either kind of a nationalism or populism, where one leader says, I'm the only one who can solve everyone's problems. Everyone outside of me and my followers are enemies. that under nationalism, one particular group or one particular religion or one particular race is the prime identity of the country or the province, and everyone else is not equal and does not deserve the same respect as whatever the chosen group are. So you can see that without naming names or without naming political parties, these two basic ideas are in conflict with one another. And how, you know, each country and each area's own particular history will determine how these ideas are played out. But there is a fundamental conflict between these two opposing philosophies. And it's difficult in times of stress, in times of economic stress, in times of military stress, in times of social stress. It's hard for small L liberal ideas to win the day. And it's a much easier fallback position for people to support populist or nationalistic ideas because they offer simple solutions to very difficult and unsolvable problems. Um, and um, and if we look at the way things are going today in many parts of the world, and especially around here, um, you could see why sort of populistic ideas and nationalistic ideas seem to be gaining strength in so many places, you know, because of all the stress that have been put on society in recent times. Um, um, it's easy for a political party or for a person to set up false enemies, straw men, sometimes people call it, to explain why an individual's life is so difficult or why they're not getting ahead, and say, well, it's not the fault of the person, it's the fault of X, Y, and Z, a race, a language, a nationality, or another religion, anybody but that person. So it's easy to cast blame on others to explain away the difficult times that people are facing. And, you know, we don't have to go very far looking around to find actual examples of this whole philosophy being played out in our times. You could you know, put so many different examples on this. You know, just to take a few, you know, you don't have to listen to the candidate Trump for more than 5 minutes before he blames somebody else for America's problems and not the state of society as a whole or the state of the economy as a whole. But it's easier to blame immigrants. It's easier to blame people who have, you know, opposing ideas of his for the so-called mess that the United States is in. In fact, the United States is not in a mess. But if you look at to go, you know, to go to the previous thing that I was mentioning, how Muslims are now going to be blamed in Russia for everything that's going on there that's negative. In India, Muslims are you know, being considered to be a non-patriotic part of the country. In China, the Muslim population is being blamed for being anti-Chinese. So it doesn't take much. Obviously, the war in Israel, between Israel and Gaza, has on the nationalistic side has inflamed right-wing people's views of the Muslim population in Israel and of Palestinians in general, and so you know, this sort of blaming idea goes on. In the um, people are told false or inaccurate information to make them feel insecure. So, in other words, for a politician, they have to first create an enemy and then say, I'm the one who can save you. First, create somebody who isn't you and say, these people are threatening you and I'm going to save you from them. So, you know, in the US, you know, living here, I hear a lot of complaints that the people on welfare and poor people in general are pulling down society, and no one should do anything to help them because these people can't help themselves. And then, in a certain sense, you know, these people, especially if they're immigrants, are sucking the wealth out of the country. And that sort of view is common enough in the US. And it's a view that Trump magnifies by saying that more and more immigrants are pouring over the border in order to take people's jobs, in order to dilute you know, the blood of the country, meaning that the white people are being replaced by non-white people. And it sort of gives an excuse for people who are feeling bad about themselves or people who are in a bad economic situation to say, well, look, I've done everything I could, and it's the fault of all the enemies of the state that you know, I'm feeling so bad. This is pure manipulation. It's pure bigotry. It's pure scapegoating, and it works. Certainly in the case of the United States. In the case of Cuba, for example, you know, they blame the United States for all the economic ills that the country is having, um, and not the regime itself for having created a kind of an impoverished nation. Um, uh, on the Democratic side, there is talk about how unequal the United States is and how wealthy people are getting away without paying taxes, and how um, they take advantage of the situation in every which way, and that how the solution to the problem, of course, is to tax the rich and distribute the money to everybody else. So you can see that this sort of blame game is something that not just one side of the political spectrum uses, or not one particular ethnic group or religion uses. It's something that's common enough in the lives of people all around the world, and it's a sort of divide and conquer philosophy. It's it's a way, in a certain sense, to break down the strength of a country, which is only strong when it's united among all its different groups. But it's so much easier for a politician who is from a different group to blame other groups for the problems that the country has, rather than to blame nobody and say, look, the way things go, there's always changes in the world. There's always winners and losers. The economy goes ups and downs. The supply and demand are factors which change all the time. And it's just the nature of change that makes some people's lives easier and some people's lives harder. Certainly, technology is something that had a huge effect. Certainly, the COVID epidemic had a huge effect, and it's much easier to blame um, people with faces than to just say, well, you know, this is the way society works. That changes are always going to be happening, and people are always going to be kind of left behind in a certain sense. And it's not their fault, but it's not the fault of anybody else either. So it's a brave politician who would some sort of come up with that sort of a formula. Um, the um, the way that people are being made to feel insecure, for example, in the U.S., is to say that you are worse off today than you were 4 years ago, which is not true in the majority of cases. It's not true by statistical averages. Uh, they claim that crime is up tremendously and that the United States is being crime infested, but really, again, completely not true. That overall in the country, the murder rates and the serious crime rates are down compared to 4 years ago. Um, uh, that like I said before, that immigrants are pouring over the border to take people's jobs. And the fact is that unemployment in the United States and in Canada is at practically a record low, and that anybody who wants a job can find one. If you just look around to all the help wanted signs everywhere, that's proof of that. Um, they claim that immigrants are burdens on healthcare, which again is not really true because, elderly immigrants, elderly people are the ones who consume the most healthcare, and elderly people are not likely to immigrate to another country and start their lives over again. Very often, immigrants who do come, not all the time, but most often, they don't come with children. They'll leave their children with the grandparents and they'll come themselves to do the work. So, obviously that's not always the case, but in general, that's what it is. Um, um, Artificial intelligence, something that is not all that well understood, is something that is something that can be blamed for taking people's jobs away. And so you could see how, um, for somebody or for a movement that supports an open and free and small L liberal society, that um, any kind of stressor is something that's going to be working against that. And whether the opponent of that is a populist, somebody like Mr. Trump, or somebody like Mr. Erdogan in Turkey, somebody like Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, um, somebody like Mr. Putin in Russia. It's just so easy to make artificial enemies, and then, or not artificial enemies, but to create an enemy within the country and to blame the society's ills on that enemy. It's a tried and true formula that has been working for a long, long time. It's mostly successful, but it's also not productive, and it's also not something that will make the country stronger. It's something that makes the country weaker, because you have elements that the ones who are the underdogs, the ones who are being persecuted, they can't contribute in full to the society, um, that they would have done on an ordinary way. And we, of course, know this personally from Quebec's history of being anti-Anglophone, and to see how much productivity has been lost to Quebec by people who have left the province, or people whose energies are directed outside the province. So, from our own personal history, we understand clearly that this approach um, of nationalism and populism is not one that benefits a country, whether it's here or whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Israel or wherever it may be. This kind of dividing society up into favored groups and unfavored groups is never a good idea if you believe in an open, free, and liberal society. So that's just something that came to mind. Um, a bit touching on that is the issue about, and I mentioned artificial intelligence, but There is a court case going on in the United States about how um, information is transmitted and judged in the society, and whether or not there should be controls on information that is posted online on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube or on any of these other social media vehicles. And there are two kind of different ideas or different philosophies involved. One is that if you are a news organization, you have a responsibility to report things accurately and correctly. You're not allowed to make up fake news. You're not allowed to um, disseminate uh, material which could lead to violence, which could lead to prejudice, etc. And you're not really allowed to lie because you are a news organization. Now, on the other hand, if you are not a news organization, but let's say you are just a transmitter of information, you are, in other words, a telephone company. The telephone companies are not responsible for conversations that are on the telephone. Clearly, what they are is a communications company, and they can't control what is being communicated. So the court case really is an interesting one. Does the Facebook or Twitter or Instagram have a responsibility to moderate and to in a way, weed out bad actors and bad communications? Or are they just like a telephone line where whatever goes in comes out at the end, and the communication service is just that? It's not, doesn't have a responsibility to control, to moderate, or in any way to focus what is being communicated. So this is an interesting case, really, and it's one that's going to be played out for a very long time in the court. And the problem is that if it's decided, or if it's people feel that these new media are responsible for the content, and many of these new media feel that they are in some way responsible, that the moment that mistakes are made, or the moment that a viewpoint is allowed to be broadcast, which it could be harmful, then these companies themselves can be held responsible for doing that and for the actions that result from those communications. And so they would love to say or pretend that, look, we are just like a phone company, and we don't have responsibility over who says what on the telephone lines. On the other hand, society looks at them and say, well, things have changed. Nobody reads newspapers anymore. So since news is being disseminated in different ways, these new vehicles should be responsible for whatever people are getting online, because if they're not, this could lead to all kinds of horrible tragedies and mass shootings and things that we've seen, with our own two eyes in U.S. and Canada and Russia yesterday, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is really kind of an interesting discussion, which will not be ended soon, but it's one I think that we have to be aware of. Now, my last, let me just check my notes over here. Yeah. My last subject, which I touched on before, which I wanted to look at again, but we may not have the time to do all of it, is to look at this whole idea about reparations. And of course, it touches on the things that I've mentioned before, which is that if a group has been discriminated against in the past, how do you make up for it in the present? And it's a subject that has been certainly come to light, to come to fore in the 21st century, and in Canada and the United States in particular. These things are being looked at all the time, and it's an ongoing struggle, or an ongoing societal issue that doesn't have an end point. And you know what? You can almost make a connection in a certain sense. You can make a connection, as I was reading today about the Palestinian refugees, how these people's refugee status, unlike any other refugees, continues on and on and on. And the United Nations takes on responsibility for these people seemingly forever. In the same way, the whole discussion about reparations to groups who've been hard done by is one that doesn't have an endpoint. And so long as these groups are marginalized in society, so long as these groups have poorer standard of living and poorer health care and poorer education, that the claim is that society is responsible to fix all these things without there being an end point. So this idea is one which is going to be and is coming to the fore as a result of the United States elections, and certain more radical candidates for office are demanding that the country somehow or other make reparations to the Black population, and perhaps to the Native population for past historical wrongs. And so it's certainly something that's worth discussing and mentioning and bringing up. So let me talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about the Black population in the United States and their demand for reparations. A demand which, started, of course, at the end of the Civil War, but took a much more of a strong role since the Civil Rights movement in the 1960s, and the ongoing police actions, wrong actions against Black people. There was just a case now in Mississippi where this 5-member goon squad who just beat up and arrested Blacks for pretty well no reason. They've been sentenced to very long sentences in jail for those misdeeds. And so the Black communities will say, okay, look, society now recognizes that we've been discriminated against for so long. How do you make up, or how do you repair this centuries-long mistreatment in this day and age? And many ideas are being put forward, but the facts have to really come first. And of course, in the United States, the Black people who are living there now are mostly all descended from slaves who were brought from Africa without their permission, obviously. Slaves who were exploited, slaves who were mistreated, slaves who were moved around. And in particular, when slavery ended in the United States in the end of the Civil War in 1865, that these slaves were never compensated or paid for their work. So in other words, you had millions of people who were free in theory, but who had absolutely no assets to work with or to build with, and therefore who started off their free life in a kind of a much worse situation than they would have been in had they been regular immigrants to the country with an ability to own land, with ability to go to school, ability to save money, etc., etc., etc. So the poor living conditions that Blacks are suffering from today in the United States are attributed by them to the foundation of their community in slavery. And therefore, they say that we do have a right to be compensated or for actions to be taken to equalize our situation in society because of all the years of discrimination that we have suffered. So obviously the discrimination wasn't just slavery, but the 100 years after slavery ended, from 1865 to 1965, where Blacks were officially discriminated against in the southern states, unofficially discriminated against in the northern states, not being able to get good jobs, not being able to buy properties in good neighborhoods, being sent to poor schools, being given poor health care, being discriminated against in practically every aspect of social, educational, and economic life. And so these people say, well, the time is to rectify that, and how it should be rectified is through some sort of reparations. The first step, of course, is to recognize that there is a problem, to apologize for the problem, and then to fix the problem. So this is what the Blacks say. So I'm going to just give you some interesting statistics that I was reading about. 60% of Blacks in the US say that they are descended from slaves. To me, that seems like a pretty low number, but there are some people who were never enslaved in the United States, some Black people. And of course, there's Black people who came after the Civil War to live in the United States from Africa and from South America or Central America. And these people may never have been slaves, certainly in Africa, but if they were slaves in Latin America, then they're products of slavery, but they chose to live as free people in the United States. 85% of Blacks say that the legacy of slavery affects Blacks today. So this is really what the important argument is, that it's an ongoing issue. It's not one that ended back in 1865, that the disabilities that the Blacks suffer are passed on from generation to generation until this very day. Now, more Democrats, among Blacks, more Democratic supporters than Republican supporters, and more educated and wealthier people say that they are affected. So there is differences of opinion, and obviously people who are more educated, people who are more democratic and democratic supporters of the Democratic Party, say that Blacks today are affected by what happened many years ago. 77% of Blacks say that these descendants of slaves should be compensated. Obviously, more Democratic supporters than Republican supporters say this, but the overwhelming majority of Black people in the United States, whether they're Democratic or Republican, say that the Blacks should be compensated for all of this centuries of mistreatment. On the other hand, if you ask society in general, in other words, the non-Black population in the United States, because Blacks in the US are about 14% of the population. So 86% of the people who are not Black, maybe 70, the low 70% feel that Blacks should not be compensated. And 68% of the entire country, including Blacks, therefore, say that Blacks should not be compensated. Only 17% of Blacks say that Blacks should not be compensated. So you can see then there's a very clear distinction in the country between those two philosophies, and the majority of people being non-Black, you could see clearly that compensation is not something that would be easily won. Now, what should compensation consist of? So, of the people who support reparations, 80% say that the people, Black people, should be getting special scholarships. 77 say that help for Black businesses. 76% feel that Black people should be helped to buy a home, and 70% feel that money, direct cash, should be paid to Black people. Most say, of course, say it'll never happen, and it will never happen. The U.S., the government, the federal government, they say, is the one who should pay this money, not, in other words, not cities or not counties or not states. Now, what about the idea that people who are descended from slave owners themselves paying out compensation? And many people say that should be the case. Some 60% of Blacks say that the descendants of slave owners should pay compensation. Of course, this is a really tough question, because how do you find these people who, after all the mixing and all these years, chances are that if you look at whites in the southern United States, who many of whom are descendants of slave owners, these people are poorer than the national average. So it becomes definitely, if you want to look from a practical point of view, how difficult would this be to get descendants of slave owners to actually pay up, and who do they pay and how do they pay? So it's really more of a theory than more of an idea than anything else. But after the George Floyd case, and after so much police brutality and stories about Blacks being serving life imprisonment for crimes they didn't commit, certainly there is a push somehow to get this idea on the table. It's interesting that in 2019, so these are the last statistics that I could come up with, the median Black household had $24,000 of net assets, meaning half of the Black households had less than 24,000 and half had more than 24,000. In the white figures for white people, it was 188,000. But if you don't look at the median meaning halfway in between the top and the bottom, but you look at the average, meaning you take the whole amount and divide by every individual, and then you multiply it out by the numbers. So the average was 142,000 for Blacks and 1 million for whites. In other words, because of the huge wealth that few people have, it raises the numbers of the averages by a huge amount. 25% of whites have net assets of over $1 million in the U.S., and only 4% of Black households are the same. So you could see that there is a very clear difference in the wealth of Blacks and whites, and this is attributed to real estate mostly. That Blacks never had enough money to buy real estate. And if they did, they were only allowed to buy real estate in poor neighborhoods, which didn't go up in value. So that explains that. Um, uh, so let me just finish this discussion to say that if you wanted not to pay individuals, what could society do about this? And the first thing that comes to mind is that there are historical Black colleges in the U.S., so they should be funded. The idea of scholarships to any university is an idea. Setting up museums to teach people about their history is another great idea. Um, the cultural centers, serving Blacks in every city is another idea. Um, Giving aid to poor cities with Black majorities is another idea. Um, uh, but if you have to kind of start to make lists of people to get money, this becomes a much more difficult idea because so many people these days are of mixed origins. And how do you sort of pick these things apart? There's so many people who have immigrated to the U.S. who are Black, who came from all kinds of different parts of the world. So, this is an idea which, in a certain sense, sounds justified in theory, but in practice would be very, very hard to carry out. And as I mentioned before, most people in the U.S. don't want it. So perhaps next time I'll speak about the same idea vis-a-vis the Indigenous people in Canada and the efforts about reparations on that score, of which there are more practical agreements have already been made, but a population who suffers the same disadvantages as the Blacks still suffer in the U.S. So it's after 3 o'clock, and I'm just curious to see if people have any ideas, contributions, any comments about this particular subject. Let's see what we got, or anything else. Of course, as you all know, I'm here for you, and I'm here to answer any questions that you might have about the Middle Eastern politics, which keep interesting us, the politics in Israel, situation in pretty well all around the world. There's always things to discuss. So, the floor is open, and let me hear what you have to say. Angela,
Yeah, there's nothing yet.
you're there? Okay. Just want to make sure. I want to make sure you're still there, and you're watching over this podcast, as they call it. Do people have ideas about reparations or compensations to our own Indigenous people? So, I may speak about that next time because it's such a huge subject, and it's one which is the current government has been so invested in, and the the question is when you start a meeting, you must have all been aware of this and have heard it saying, we're on native land, and then we're sorry about what happened to the natives, and now let's get on with the meeting. Is this something that is beneficial? Is it something that's useful? Is it something that is now just formulaic? How long should this continue? All kinds of questions like this of this nature come up and are continuing to come up, and we may get into this next time, but the certainly the Canadian government seems to be more invested in this idea of reparations, both symbolic ones and practical ones, than the United States is over blacks, and certainly the United States is over their own Native population.
So, Mr. Dwoskin, I see a question here. It
Yeah.
says, does Trump's manipulation of the legal system lead to cynicism?
Does what manipulation?
Trump's manipulation
Oh,
of the
of the
of the
legal
legal
system
system lead to cynicism?
lead to cynicism. I think that it's a good question. First of all, thank you for the question, and it's a very good question. It's the answer is in a way a bit complicated, because there's two sides to the answer. One side is that the legal system is supposed to serve everyone equally, and clearly it doesn't. That people who have money and people who have connections are better able to manipulate the legal system to their own advantage. The proof of the pudding was how his bond was reduced from 550 million, 575 to 175. The amount of money he had to post in order to guarantee that if he loses his appeal on the real estate case, that he will have to forfeit that money or pay that money. So the idea that one could appeal forever and ever and ever is frustrating to those who say, well, we want justice, and justice has to end at a certain point. On the other hand, the Constitution guarantees everybody the right to appeal. And the difficulty in this case is where, if the Supreme Court is the highest justice in the United States, and Trump himself picked three of these justices, since he's so personally invested in these cases, would there be a fair consideration if his cases ever get up to the Supreme Court? So we in the Western world are led to believe that justice is impartial. And if you see statues in front of courthouses, you'll see a woman with a blindfold across her face holding up a pair of scales, and the scales are balanced. So the idea there, of course, is that justice is impartial. But in practical ways, in practical terms, we certainly know that in so many different countries, justice is anything but that. You don't expect the attackers that I began with in Russia to get anything like a fair trial, even though they're guilty. And in places like China or Russia, 99.9% of anybody brought up for trial is found guilty. So yes, I think that people could get the idea that there is a sort of one system for the well-connected, for the rich people, and another system for the poor people. And especially if you see what you might call cases of miscarriages of justice on all sides. I just mentioned, we're hearing so many cases of poor people who were sentenced to long sentences for crimes they didn't commit on the one hand, and on the other hand, you see people like Trump manipulating the system as far as he can go in order to not stand trial. And I would have to bring up Mr. Netanyahu in Israel doing exactly the same thing, up on charges of fraud, bribery, and miscarriage of his job, and having avoided a trial for years now. So yes, I think that sort of does lead to a sort of a cynicism. But the big fear in the U.S. is that if Trump does get to be elected president again, that he will, ask the Justice Department to drop all federal cases against him, and in cases where it's not the federal department, he said he would issue pardons to everybody who was charged on the January 6th riots and over 1,000 people have already been found guilty. And he called these people patriots, and he said, "I'll let them out of jail as soon as I can." So it means that when politics starts to interfere with the justice system, you know that a society is not a completely free and democratic one. And that's one of the first things that people measure. If they want to measure how democratic a country is, they have to look at the court system and how independent it is from the people in power. So I do agree with you that if these things keep going on, people will be very cynical about the justice system. And I think we have to say that in general, we don't have as a politicized system in Canada as they do have it in the United States. So, any other questions?
Yes, there's another one that says from Anonymous, did you read David Brooks' article about Gaza? What did you
Yes,
think of it? What
I
did you
did.
think of his argument that Israel has no choice but the invasion and war against Hamas?
I did read the article, absolutely did read it. And it was a wonderful essay that was published in the New York Times. Yeah, I believe yesterday or the day before, one of the two. And sorry, hold on. Just a minute now. Are we back? Let's see. Sorry about that. My phone rang, and I'll have to see who it was afterwards. So the question about David Brooks's column in the New York Times was a wonderful essay, and I do agree with it. If you ask me, do I agree with it? The short answer is yes. He basically makes the common sense case which people are a bit being led away from, which is that if Hamas declared war on Israel, and the aim of Hamas is to destroy Israel, and it's not something that they've hidden, it's something that they all believe in. That if that's the case, then Israel has to destroy Hamas in order to assure its own future and security. And if Israel does not destroy Hamas completely, then it's only a matter of time till they mount another attack on Israel. As to the methods that Israel has to use, and David Brooks goes into this in quite a bit of detail. He says, look, if Hamas is, if the main weapon that Hamas is using is the suffering of the people of Gaza, and it's clear that this tactic has won. The condemnations of Israel at the United Nations, the abstention that the United States did in the United Nations yesterday, the worldwide horror at the deaths of so many children in Gaza, that this has turned the hearts of people who normally would sympathize with innocent people suffering, and these clearly are innocent people suffering, that Hamas has made tremendous use of this. And I would just say to people, just imagine that this war would be taking place exactly as it's been taking place, but there are no cameras at all, that there are no firsthand testimonies at all, that the war would be carried out in complete darkness and anonymity. Just imagine how little blowback Israel would be receiving. And, the same thing is happening in Sudan now, but there are no reporters there. There are no TV networks interested in covering this. And, many more people have died in Sudan who were ethnically cleansed and murdered than were in Gaza. So David Brooks comes back to this and says, well, Hamas is so successful at using its own population and the suffering of its own population as tools in their war, that Hamas is purposely making their own people suffer in order to win their battle. And he's all right about that. And Israel has very few choices as to how they can proceed um, by in defeating Hamas without harming the civilian population. It's an impossible choice. And so David Brooks says that Israel just has to do what it has to do and to try to minimize casualties. But, you know, the main aim is to defeat Hamas once and for all. I think it would be worthwhile for you to have a look at an article I read today about UNRWA's education system and how they have, even though UNRWA is a branch of the United Nations, they are the ones who are in charge of educating 70% of Gaza children, and how they've repeated anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli material in their school books to educate these children to be enemies of Israel, and how this is so wrong because the United Nations has approved Israel as a member, and yet they are saying in their own education books that are used, you know, that Israel has no right to exist, and Israel doesn't appear on maps in Palestinian schools run by the United Nations, and many, many, many hundreds of other examples. So that article is somewhere on the internet. You can look it up under United Nations UNRWA schooling of Palestinian children in Gaza. So, and the writer of the article contrasted this with how the vilification of Israel has been toned down in so many other Arab countries, from Morocco to Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates. And the education system in the United Arab Emirates talks about the Holocaust, talks about the state of Israel in a neutral way. And it's such a contrast to the Palestinian school books, where the Holocaust is never mentioned at all, where Israel is just seen as one occupying Palestinian territory, and you know, one which glorifies jihad and glorifies sacrificing themselves against Israel, and also one which promotes a kind of a radical version of Islam. So it was an interesting article to read in today's, and I'm not sure where I read it. It might have been in Times of Israel. So yes, the answer is David Brooks wrote a wonderful piece, and it's one which I agree with.
Okay, there's another one by Anonymous that says polyamor and populism.
That's such a good question as well. Um, it's, you know, how should I put this? You know, it's not like every politician is a black and white, good or bad, populist or not populist. You know, people are complicated, and politics is complicated, and people. One thing about politics is that, you know, you use what works and you abandon what doesn't work, and you know, also just the word populist has a negative connotation, and it's one where you could say that you know, a politician will sort of sell himself as the solution to all of people's problems, and to emphasize his own or her own particular advantages, and to promote these things. And there's a shading of populism that goes from what you might call you know, a star attraction, you know, a star in a movie, or a star in a, you know, on a hockey or something like that. And you could say if they promote themselves, they're populists. You understand the difficulties in trying to put a finger on what populism is exactly, and the negative parts about it and the positive parts about it. I think that all in all, at this point, Poilievre is not promoting himself in the way that Trump is, which, you know, remember he said, I can shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and I'll never be found guilty of anything. Where he uses the Republican Party as just a vehicle of self-promotion. I don't think Poilievre is at that point yet. I don't think he has the ability to do that. I don't think that the Conservative Party of Canada is one that will give itself up completely into Poilievre's hands and do whatever bidding he wants it to do. He doesn't come from that kind of a background, and I don't think that you could put him, for better or for worse, and I'll say for better, he's not in the same league as Trump, Netanyahu, or Putin. Those three, Viktor Orban to go along with that, Bolsonaro in Brazil to go along with that. That's a super league of populists. I think Poilievre would be in the B league or the C league as far as that goes.
Okay, there's one more question by Anonymous. Does the billion spent on the indigenous with no positive results in Canada show that reparations don't work?
So it's such a good question. I think it's a question that has no real answer because there's no real end to there's no real end to it. First of all, it's true that billions have been spent and will be spent on the Indigenous people in Canada. It's true that the Indigenous people of Canada, despite all those billions being spent, are the poorest sector in the country. Somewhere around 8% of Canada is of Indigenous origin, depending on exactly how you define these things. But to give a rough idea, somewhere around 8% of Canadians are Indigenous. More than 50% of children in social care are Indigenous. So just by that measure alone, without even looking at income, they are clearly a disadvantaged group of people. You could say people who were in favor of all this spending would say, well, if we didn't spend it, they'd be even worse off. People who are not in favor of this would say, well, it's just like shoving money down an endless bottomless pit, and it will never accomplish anything. So you've got two very different versions of the same of where spending should go and how it should be. There are differences between the American situation with Blacks and the Canadian situation with the Indigenous. One of the main differences is that the Canadian government signed treaties with the Indigenous people, which the Indigenous people understood to be very different from what the Canadian or British authorities understood these things to be. The Indigenous people would never have signed away their futures, would never have signed away their potential powers, knowing what the British or Canadians really intended by these treaties. So a treaty is one which is supposed to be an agreement where the facts are agreed to by both sides, the facts are understood by both sides, the consequences are understood by both sides. And in fact, these treaties were nothing of the kind. So therefore, from a legal point of view, you could say that Canada owes the Indigenous population, you could say, because, even the treaties that they did sign, the Canadian government did not keep the Canadian part of what those treaties were supposed to be. And, the symbolism of the treaties was also something that was not adhered to. So, in other words, the way the natives understood these treaties were that the natives can continue to live the lives that they've always lived in the same way they've always lived them, and that they would not be interfered with by the Europeans, and the Europeans saw these things as something really different. That it was a way to take away the independence of the natives. It was a way to take their land away. It was a way to control them. And so you could see how unequal these treaties were. And even, the parts that were supposed to be good to the natives, uh, the European descended people never kept their word on those parts. So there's no doubt that the indigenous people in Canada were hard done by. There's no doubt that the end result is that they live today a much worse life than the rest of the population. The United Nations, UNESCO, has looked at this and said that this is a black mark on Canada. Now, what to do about it, of course, is the big dilemma. And it's very true that Canada has already spent billions of dollars to help the natives in one way or another. It's also true that many people will see that this money was wasted, stolen, misused, unaccounted for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a problem. Whether the fact is that if the native, it's one thing to have an underserved and underprivileged and poor population who doesn't complain about their status. It's another thing where this population does complain about their status, and the indigenous are complaining. So now it becomes a dilemma of how to solve or resolve this whole issue. And it's an ongoing one. It's not one that's going to go away anytime soon. And I would say that among the indigenous people themselves, there are differences of opinion on how the problem should be solved. And I don't think it's fair to say that I don't think it's fair to say that the indigenous lives are the same as they always were, despite all the money that's being poured into them. I think it's fair to say that there has been improvement in lots of different areas in lots of different ways, but not an equal improvement and not spread all over the whole of indigenous society. So it's definitely a dilemma, and it's definitely one that's going to continue to challenge the provinces and challenge the federal government. I would just want to point out that by the Constitution of Canada, it's the federal government that, in the main, is responsible for the Indigenous people, even though these people live in the different provinces. So that adds another layer of complication. It's the provinces in general that give out the services, the education services, the health services, the welfare services, as well as the provinces paying welfare. But the federal government is the one that has responsibility over the natives, and particularly, of course, if the natives are in their own reserves or territories. So that's another layer of complication. I think that kind of opens up the discussion a little bit. So that's where it's at.
I don't see anything else, Mr. Dwoskin.
Okay, well, we're already at 3:30, so that's good. I'm happy about this. Super happy. I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank everybody for tuning in, and enjoy the spring weather. We had the first day of spring on the 21st of April. No, March. Sorry, March. We're in March. We're going into April next week, and I'll see you all next week. So thanks again, and thank you, Angela, for hosting and for taking all those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dwoskin, and thank you to everyone listening in over the telephone and online. We shall see you next week. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye bye.
Bye.